In this video, I take a deeper dive into using the 4070 Super with iRacing using the Quest 3 at 90 Hz. And all from an older gamer's perspective. In my last video, link below, I took a first impressions look at the 4070 Super and compared it to my previous card, the 3070. In that video, I found the 4070 Super wasn't a stellar leap forward performance-wise, and although it helped out on some of the more intensive tracks in iRacing, such as Okayama, I was hesitant about moving beyond 72 Hz. And the reason for this was so I could retain a decent performance headroom while sim racing. However, in the comments of that video, many of you pointed out some well-founded issues you had with this level of performance vigilance. Namely that my definition of a decent performance headroom for the 4070 Super was around 50%, and frankly many of you thought this to be overly cautious and leaving far too much performance on the table. And in fact, not really the sort of thing sim racers should be doing anyway.
Let's throw caution to the winds.
I had a think about this and decided to revisit my test scenarios, but this time without comparing the 4070 Super to the 3070 and instead focusing on how to get the best, the absolute best from the 4070 Super and still tread that perilous tightrope between performance and graphical fidelity. For this video, I'm going to stick with testing just iRacing, but in future videos, I will be doing a deeper dive into optimizing both AMS2 and ACC in VR using the 4070 Super. But for this video, I am going to do the following. Focus on how to best optimize my PC, identify the most performance-intensive settings in iRacing when using VR, and finally, when I have the optimal settings dialed in for my PC using the 4070 Super, I will compare the standard Oculus way of accessing the sim with OpenXR when modified using the OpenXR Toolkit. A lot to cover, so I'm going to dive straight in. Time codes are available, as always, for you to skip to those sections you are most interested in, or you can just watch the whole thing. Optimizing my PC. The first performance-enhancing tactic I tried was a clean install of the NVIDIA driver. Since I made the last video a whole 5 days ago, a new driver has been released by NVIDIA, so I figured while I was putting that on, I would do a clean install and see if that made any difference to performance. I used NV Clean Install to add driver 551.23 to my system, and only the driver. Then, after a reboot, went through the various suggestions on the iRacing VR forums on how to optimize the NVIDIA control panel. You can find more details there, but roughly speaking, most of what I changed appears in bold in the NVIDIA control panel, but do check out those guides before you do anything here. This is not for the faint-hearted.
Computers, that's not really my area.
Once I had done that, I went through the task tray and closed down anything I didn't need for iRacing, and did something similar, although slightly more long-winded, in the task manager. Please attempt these things at your own risk. No harm came to my system when I did them, but I have been building computers for several decades now, and I know more or less what I'm doing. Make sure you have a recent backup of your system before you start to mess around with it, just in case something goes badly wrong.
Computers, right?
All of this can feel like a thankless task as the task manager fills up again with unwanted stuff at the next reboot, as does the task tray if you don't start restricting what can launch at boot. But if you can find the will to do all of this, it is often worth the effort, performance-wise. With that done, I looked at how I could squeeze a little more power from my Asus 4070 Super OC version, which I paid extra for, and I did this by downloading and installing GPU Tweak 3. With this, I was able to overclock my 4070 Super to the advertised 10% extra that the OC version can comfortably attain. And I could do this with just one click. This one here, in fact. As you can see, this now gives me an increased GPU boost clock and a 10% increase in power. If you have never tried overclocking a graphics card, I can tell you this is as simple as it gets. There are other overclocking options available in this app, but I will save exploring those for a future video. Once this was all done, I retested the 4070 Super in 3D Mark using the Speedway test again, and this showed the score jumping from 4,553 to 5,130. That's an increase of 12.7% over my initial tests with the 4070 Super, which in itself was about 48% faster than the 3070. So I have made progress with optimizing my PC and getting more power from the 4070 Super. But will these changes make any difference at all in VR in the Quest 3 while I'm racing in iRacing? Let's find out. The test baseline for the 4070 Super outputting to the Quest 3 at 90Hz with the Oculus debug tool set at 500 encode bitrate, which is probably the longest section title I've ever had, but it is what it is. Anyway, before I begin running benchmarks on my newly optimized PC, I first changed the refresh rate of the Quest 3 to 90Hz with the render at 1.7x to give me native resolution inside the Quest 3. I left the Oculus debug tool at 500 encode bitrate and all the other settings at default apart from the ASW, which I turned off, although in my experience that doesn't stop it coming back on again. A lot of the comments I had from the last video expressed an interest in seeing how 90Hz performed with the 4070 Super, and while I personally don't see much difference between 90Hz or 72Hz, I wanted to make sure the tests I carried out were in line with the majority interest. The tests you will see here are in an AI race with 12 cars, just to set a repeatable baseline, but I will also show some real races with more cars towards the end of this video. The car I chose was the MX-5 because I wanted something with a windscreen and because the car is free with iRacing and most people have driven it and know how it performs on their system. I then chose Okayama as the test track because again it's free to everyone, plus it's a very performance demanding track with 3D curves and all sorts of other enhancements. My thinking is if I can get a decent performance here at 90Hz, I'm likely to get it most other places as well, with the disclaimer that I haven't tried all the tracks in iRacing, so there's that.
That is so disappointing.
Settings that have a minimal effect on performance headroom in iRacing while using VR. So, as a baseline for getting the most from the 4070 Super, here are the base settings from top to bottom, which I've chosen as they have the least effect on performance headroom. Here you can see I've turned up Sky, Cars, Pit Objects, Events, Grandstands and Objects all to high, with only Crowds at low and Particles at medium. Now, putting so many of these settings at high might seem a little reckless, and you might wonder if the older gamer is going too far in the opposite direction and substituting caution for recklessness. In my defense, let me show you Sky, Cars and Pit Objects and so on set to low as seen on the left, while on the right here these settings are at high with the exception of Crowds and Particles in both. Yes, the image on the left looks a bit basic and gives me flashbacks to my Xbox 360 days. Trust me, in the Quest 3 it looks even worse. But if you look at the performance headroom of both, you can see there is not a lot of difference between the two, with the low settings on the left averaging out around 60% performance headroom, while the high settings on the right are about 59%. There's really no difference at all. But of course, you also have to take into account that the other settings, Shadow, MSAA, or anything particularly GPU taxing, are currently not active in these examples. That will come in the next section of this video. So lastly, in this baseline for testing, I have the driver arms set to shown, cockpit mirrors set to 3, which works for most cars, and all the other settings turned off. I don't need a virtual mirror. In fact, I hate it. And I don't need to know how detailed a tree is unless I'm about to face plant one. It's also worth mentioning that settings here in the upper left section of the graphical tab can be changed on the fly without having to close down and relaunch the sim. Some of the settings inside iRacing require the game to be reset, shut down, and then relaunched in order to take any effect at all, and some do not. The UI does mention this occasionally, with some handy orange markers for a few of the settings that require a reset. But unfortunately, the UI forgets to mention a number of other settings that also require a reset of the sim in order for them to be enabled or disabled.
Thanks for that.
It would be better if iRacing introduced a graphical catch-all that invoked a reminder when a setting was changed that required the sim to be relaunched. AMS2 does this, and I believe ACC does as well. In fact, most games and apps in the PC universe do have this feature, so I'm really not sure why iRacing does not. One for the devs to include as a quality of life improvement perhaps for the future. Before I move on to the real performance killers in this settings area, I also activated sharpening here, taking me down to around 58% headroom, and also the render track data, which shows the track being used as the race goes on, rubber marking and so on. This reduced the headroom by a further % or 2, which put me to a headroom of around 57%. But I can bring that down even further. Just watch me. Settings that have the most effect on performance headroom in iRacing in VR at 90 Hz. With the stuff that doesn't have much effect on the performance headroom optimally set up for the 4070 Super at 90 Hz in VR, it's time to look at those graphical settings in iRacing that do have an effect, a big effect, on frame rate. The first performance killer is dynamic objects, which is found in the shadow maps area. Using this setting adds a shadow that casts relative to the object's position to the sun or other lights, and also adds shadow to the detailed areas of the car and to the cockpit. Because the shadow can move as the object moves, for example a car moving around a track relative to the light source, this chews through the system resources like you wouldn't believe and absolutely tanked my performance headroom, even with all the other settings in the middle area set to off. Here you can see the readout dropping down to a very low percentage point, regardless of which track I used or how many cars there were. If you want to avoid just one setting in iRacing, this is the first one to shun.
I'm being shunned.
Object self-shadowing I found to be minimal in its graphical contribution and not worth the performance hit, so I turned that off as well. However, shadow maps I left turned on as I find shadows from trees and other trackside objects visually immersive when in VR. They do impact performance, but only marginally as seen here, where it dropped the performance headroom by around 5%. You can also play with the shader quality setting at the bottom, setting it either high or ultra, but if you choose anything lower than high, some of those settings here will be disabled. I found high to offer good performance and was visually indistinguishable to me from ultra. You should play around with these, see what suits you. The next setting to be careful of is MSAA, multi-sampling anti-aliasing. This is used to smooth the edges of pixels, basically trying to make things look prettier, and it does a good job. However, once you move the MSAA to 8x, it totally tanks the performance headroom. Here are the 3 MSAA settings, with 2x on the left, 4x in the middle, and 8x on the right. From this result, I decided that 4x proved to be a better bet, as the hit to performance was negligible at that level, but the smoothing still looked pretty good. I look next at anisotropic filtering, or however you pronounce that, which helps to make distant objects look sharper. Here are all 4 settings. I found anisotropic filtering had a minimal impact on performance headroom regardless, really, of which setting I used, even when set to 16x. That being said, in combination with the other settings, it did reduce the performance headroom still further to a grand total of 30%. Regardless of this, I decided to leave it set at 16x. Lastly, I dabbled a little with anti-aliasing, which is found here in the bottom right. FXAA I found to be the better of the two options, performance-wise, but I still found it took another 10% off my headroom, leaving me now with 20%, while the SMAA variant of AA took me all the way down to 5% headroom, which is a little low, even for this new devil-may-care older gamer. In reality, I found both didn't really add much for me to the overall visual quality, so I left them turned off and decided that my final settings for iRacing at 90Hz using the Quest 3 through the 4070 Super should be this. At these settings, plus the 10% overclock of my 4070 Super, plus the optimizations of my PC, I was able to achieve an average performance headroom of around 30%, more or less. Even at Okayama, frame rate was always fairly stable at 90 FPS. Some drops to 89 FPS, which I think is standard for iRacing. I see this drop backwards and forwards a lot when I'm out on the track. Sometimes it just sits at 89 FPS for most of the race. So I'm not really sure how accurate the FPS indicator actually is. But that being said, these settings allowed me to race most tracks at 90 FPS with some exceptions, like Willow Springs, one of the newer, prettiest and more detailed tracks in iRacing, which did see a drop in performance headroom. Although to be fair, this was a real race with 30 cars, so there's that. But I didn't see any drops in FPS at Willow Springs either, and the ASW never kicked in, not once, not even at the start on the grid where the performance was really low, and it always gave me a decent but not overly ambitious performance headroom. I will probably have to turn some of these settings down for races that feature a lot of cars on very complex tracks, but for the main, they seem to work across a variety of tracks and give me glitch-free racing in iRacing in the Quest 3 with some very smooth visuals and some stunning graphics at 90Hz, and that does make me very happy. With the settings sorted out, finally, and after lots of reboots and a lot of testing, I was ready to take them to the tracks. Here I am in various cars. First up is the MX-5 Rookie Race at Okayama. This is a real race, not an AI race. And yes, the settings that I dialed in cope with no real problems all the way round, even at difficult and performance-intensive corners, or coming past the home straight. Willow Springs, as I mentioned earlier, was a bit tougher for these settings, but they still performed without frame drops, even if the performance headroom sometimes dipped down to single figures. Lime Rock Park here is a different problem, as the puffing of smoke from the slow-moving Formula Vs can be very performance intensive for the GPU, but again, the 4070 Super with these settings coped just fine. In fact, it offered the best performance headroom of all three tests. Finally, just for a laugh, I decided to go oval racing just to see what the performance headroom was like in that arena. Here is a real-life race with these insanely fast cars going round in a circle. As you can see, using the standard Oculus way of entering the sim, plus the settings I worked out as optimal for the 4070 Super on my system, I got some pretty decent performance headroom. Never really saw much in the way of drop frames, even when there were some mega crashes. And I thoroughly enjoyed the experience.
That's so cool.
It's crazy.
The OpenXR Toolkit. Next, I delved into OpenXR with the aid of the OpenXR Toolkit, which you can download for free. Once installed, you open the companion app in order to make some small changes to the interface. I suggest changing the defaults to the down, up, left and right arrows by clicking and selecting here. With that done, you can close the companion app. You won't be needing it again. The OpenXR Toolkit can only be accessed from inside the sim, so I launched iRace and selected an AI race going for Okayama, so that I would get a rough idea of what the OpenXR Toolkit could do for performance. And once on the track, I launched the OpenXR Toolkit and I started to play around with the settings. The first thing I activated was the Show Expert settings in the menu area, and this is so I can gain access to some of the cooler stuff. Here on this menu, I could turn on the FPS indicator, as the Oculus performance meter in the Oculus debug tool doesn't work when you're accessing the sim via the OpenXR method. I then played around with the settings, mostly following the guide on the iRacing forums, and finished with these settings that controlled scaling and sharpening. I did like the sunglasses option in the appearance tab, as this created a nice bit of contrast to the overall Sim's image. Bear in mind that while this works for me, it might not work for you, so treat this as a starting position in this interface rather than a podium place. I don't have a lot of experience with OpenXR Toolkit, and the UI tends to wear its complex UI naming systems as though they are a badge of geeky pride, so it could possibly be that there is a better visual solution than the one I came up with, and if anyone has it, please comment below. As I mentioned, performance in the OpenXR Toolkit is measured via the toolkit and not the Oculus debug tool, which isn't the ideal way to conduct a test, but it is what it is, and I think it's fairly representative of the sort of thing we are likely to see. Looking at the results here, you can see the performance headroom in OpenXR when using the foveated rendering in the toolkit, which effectively creates an area outside of your direct eye line that has a reduced render resolution and is supposed to then improve a performance headroom. Here you can see OpenXR on the left and the normal way of entering the sim using Oculus on the right. There is definitely a better performance with the OpenXR. It's mostly hovering around the 30% mark, while the Oculus method is bouncing around between 15 and 25%, particularly in the busy places on certain areas of the track where we know from experience there is poor performance. On the flats where nothing much is going on, still the OpenXR is doing better. Coming into this very busy corner here, you can see the Oculus drops down to 20, 17 sometimes, but the OpenXR is holding its own. So generally speaking, yeah, I would say that the performance is better. It's not wildly better, but it will help out in those times when you've got a lot of cars on the track and you need every ounce of performance from your computer. This will be a winner for you. I personally found it better playing OpenXR. I can't quite say why. There was something visually appealing about the OpenXR render display. The cars in some way seemed real when they were coming up to me, more so than in the normal Oculus way of viewing the sim. It's difficult to encapsulate what I mean by this. You actually have to see it yourself. It's like the Matrix. Nobody can tell you about it. You have to see it. But when I'm actually in the sim, OpenXR feels a lot more real than the Oculus method of accessing the sim. So combine those two together, you get better performance and you get a more immersive, realistic sim. I think OpenXR is a real winner. Conclusion. So if you missed it in the mix there, here are the settings I was able to use at 90 Hz using the Quest 3 with the 4070 Super. And they are, it has to be said, pretty impressive settings. Using them now in my day-to-day racing, I am caught by just how much detail I was missing before when I was using the 3070 at the lower settings. Having a crowd around the track really does add an extra level of immersion to the VR experience, as does the litany of background objects from parked cars and trucks to distant factories puffing smoke from industrial chimneys. It's all very evocative, it really is, especially when it's seen at this level of detail, this level of graphical fidelity. It is as though, with these settings, and through the extra power the 4070 Super affords my system, that iRacing has taken on an extra lease of life. In some ways, it's like playing a brand new and enhanced version of the sim. And of course, let's not forget the revelation that is OpenXR, which many of you told me to use, but for some reason I just not got round to it. Boy, am I glad I did try it. Am I glad I followed your advice. It really is a game changer when it comes to extra performance options, and also, at least in my view, it gives you better and more believable graphics. I really can't wait to try it in ACC and AMS too. OpenXR is not perfect, of course. Some textures, particularly some track surfaces, can look a little muddy in certain parts of the track. Coming downhill at Lime Rock Park can look a little unrealistic. So OpenXR, and I guess the toolkit, have room for improvement. But right now it's going to give you better performance if you use OpenXR. And let's be realistic, that's probably the main reason you're here watching this video. Some people also asked in my last video if my Intel 13600K CPU was struggling under the load of VR and sim racing software. This is difficult to find a metric for, as a lot of CPU benchmark software also has an impact on other programs that are running. But I have found this simple CPU usage gadget, placed it next to iRacing and ran a real race. I ran in the MX5 and I also did an oval race, and it showed this. As you can see, iRacing uses only one core of my multi-core processor. There are more cores fluctuating around here, but that's probably the Oculus using it on Windows and all sorts of other stuff. But the big readout, if you can call it that, is the iRacing thread that's running on that particular core. And as you can see, it's not devastatingly high, is it, really? Granted, these are only 12 cars that I'm looking at here, but I don't expect it to be much higher with a lot more cars. With an AI race, yes, sure, I think the CPU is going to be running a little hotter, but that's because the computer is generating the cars for the race at the same time as trying to race the race, instead of displaying the race, which is tough enough. But as you can see, my 13600K CPU from Intel copes just fine. So to wrap up, I wanted to say to you all that I've learned a lot from the feedback on my last video, including how to pronounce Jesus, although I still can't manage to say it correctly after all these years of saying Jesus. But mainly, through creating this video, I got back into something that I have not been doing for years, mostly because PCs have become so much easier to build and so much faster. It was something I didn't really need to do, namely PC optimization. Something I always used to do with every single PC I ever built, but something that I had somehow lost the habit, probably because, as I say, PCs have become so powerful. And it's not really a pressing problem, unless of course you're trying to run a VR headset with a performance-aggressive racing simulator. With all your help, I was able to revisit and redo and retest. And I hope you will agree, this effort has been more than worthwhile. I now have a machine that will run VR at 90 Hz with a decent performance headroom, with a lot more of the settings active in the iRacing graphics tab than I've ever had, and with zero-ish dropped frames, depending of course on the track being raced. I am content, and nothing now can stop me enjoying 90 Hz in VR, in iRacing, on the Quest 3 for the foreseeable future. Oh, for really, Meta? You update the app just as I finish the video? Thanks a lot, Meta. Thanks a In a future video, I will revisit these tests and see how well the Quest 3 runs iRacing on the 4070 Super at 120 Hz. And I will enjoy the experience. Oh yes, I will. Until next time, race clean, don't read any Meta press releases, and I will see you on track. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button, and if you haven't already done so, subscribe. Click the little bell icon if you want to be notified of any future videos.